So here we are in the middle of another scorching hot American summer, and after rewatching 13th this week, I think the biggest takeaway that I've gotten is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Welcome to No Alter Egos. I'm your host, Trll Kennedy. We're back for another really incredible week of great talk and conversation. This week, we're taking a look at the 13th documentary by Ava DuVernay for Netflix. And it's very prescient in this moment, especially with the recent shooting in Akron, Ohio of Jayland Walker. There are those who are going to have, of course, already heard about this. For those who haven't, this young black man who was getting ready to be pulled over for, I guess, a traffic violation, which is how these things always seem to start. But at any rate, he ended up trying to flee for some reason that is still, as of yet, unknown. What is known, however, and has been shown in the body footage that has since been released. And I'm beginning to notice a pattern that if it's especially egregious, the police and local authorities work to try and hide the footage. But if it's especially egregious and they feel justified, then they release the footage quickly to give room and space for the community to get the anger out, so that when they come out maybe a few days, weeks, or months later to say that there will be no charges filed, that there will have already been some kind of catharsis for the community in having seen and witnessed the horrible execution of another citizen. But it really brought me back to 13th. I wanted to remind myself of what exactly goes on a day-to-day basis in this country and what some of the historical roots and origins of it are. And in rewatching 13th, there was a really, and you know what, let's just get things kicked off, started properly, by the way. If you're listening in, whether it's on WHPB, WUVS, or WVBH-LP, welcome back to the show. We spoke about this a few weeks ago, how there's going to be just a change in the content and transitioning of the show towards interviews and documentaries, documentary synopses. So this week we're continuing on in that documentary synopsis series, Let's Doc About It. And as I mentioned just a short while ago, this week we're covering the 13th documentary by Ava DuVernay. It wasn't particularly brought on by the police killing of Jayland Walker. However, I feel like it's very relevant in this moment to discuss what it is that has led up to even those moments that are caught on police body cam, where even if they have cameras watching them, they feel as though shooting 90 times at a perceived suspect, hitting them 60 times and Swiss cheesing someone's body is somehow justified in their line of duty and in their scope of work. But I realized something, and if you are listening in, don't forget to check us out on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you for coming by and listening this week. I am Trll Kennedy, as I said earlier, and in addition to being a songwriter, artist, and musician, I'm also someone that cares deeply about humanity and society, about the societies that we build for ourselves. And that has been part of the reason why I made this podcast, why I do this podcast, is because I feel as though while I can't shed light and truth on literally everything that goes on, it's important for everyone, or at least as many people as can be, to just be aware of what's going on. I think so many times we get confused about the way and state of the world that we don't understand and realize that there are very conscious and deliberate decisions being made by people that drive and determine the shape and the outcomes of our societies. And so that's one of the big reasons why I could have stuck to doing maybe a strictly entertainment-based podcast. But for me, I want to find a way, without bringing doom and gloom constantly, to really shed light. And this is a part of the reason why this docuseries, or why this mini-series in this podcast is beginning, is to really shed light on documentaries. It's one of my favorite forms of content. And there are so many incredible filmmakers out there that have really just put the lens and shed the spotlight on really important issues within society that don't get talked about too much. So if you are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know where you're from. If you're listening in on the radio, go to the YouTube channel, like and subscribe to the channel. You can follow me on Instagram at Trll Kennedy. That's with no I, so just TRLL KENNEDY. Or you can follow the show at No Alter Egos on both Instagram and Facebook. I wanted to get that kind of official stuff out the way because I really do want to dive into the meat of this really incredible documentary. But there's something that I noticed as I was watching it, is that there is so much that Ms. DuVernay was trying to do as she put this together. And I didn't realize until the end just how all-encompassing it was. It's an hour and 40 minutes of runtime. And in that hour and 40 minutes, it touches on everything from the end of slavery to the loophole written into the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and how it has led to our current society, how it is that mass incarceration, Jim Crow, lynchings, the convict leasing system in the Reconstruction era, there are all these things that have now been the byproduct, very deliberate byproducts of a very devious loophole that was written into the 13th Amendment to our Constitution. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't do a good job, because I think it does an excellent job. But it wasn't until I got near the end of the documentary that I realized just how much she was attempting to tackle, how difficult that job is, and how even though she did attempt to do it, there's still so much more that can be and should be said about all the topics that are covered in 13th. But I just think real quick before we jump into the full synopses, it's important to get a little bit of history behind that amendment, behind the documentary itself, and how it even came into existence. So the 13th Amendment, as we know it to be, is the one that supposedly transformed the great sin of America's past. It was supposed to have redeemed us as a country. It was the amendment to our Constitution just outside of the Bill of Rights that said that slavery was forever abolished. However, what 13th definitely points out in its opening minutes, and I'm going to get to that in the synopsis, is that it's not really true. Slavery was never really fully abolished inside of our country. It was instead made a function of the state, whereby if you were ever duly convicted of a crime, you could be subjected to slavery. It's just that no one could take a person who's a non-criminal and make them a slave. It's something that in the century and a half since it was written has led to us, and I'm talking about the United States, as a country, despite having only 5% of the world's population, containing 25% of the world's prisoners. 1 in every 4 people that is currently incarcerated or in chains on planet Earth is incarcerated here in the United States, and speaks volumes to the amount of people that we are incarcerating here in the US when you have countries like India and China that are pushing on 1 billion citizens and still yet do not have the same amount of prisoners that the US, with 1/3 of their population size, actually has in terms of how many people we incarcerate. There's been so much fallout that has come from it, and everything from Jim Crow to loitering laws, which literally is being told you can't exist in a certain public space if there's private property that exists in that public space. So if you're by a business out on the sidewalk, even though it's public space, there's a private business there, and loitering makes it illegal to exist in that public space past any certain length and period of time. It's really interesting to see how those laws have developed as a result of the 13th Amendment and the loophole that was written into it. And moreover, it goes to show you the stranglehold that slavery, which has its roots in our country and still has its roots and teeth sunk into the literal fabric of our society, how powerful it is in that Congress, since passing the 13th Amendment, which was only recently fully ratified, I think back in like 2013, Mississippi became the final state to fully ratify the 13th Amendment. But like, when we consider how deep into our society slavery has sunk its teeth, such that Congress has never made an attempt to really fully abolish slavery, it just goes to show you how powerful that institution was and still remains to this day. But let's not dwell so much on the history. So the history of it was that, obviously, in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation following the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was written into and eventually passed by Congress, abolishing slavery except as punishment of crime. And from there, a whole host of things have trickled on. So let's find out exactly what 13th has highlighted, what that means for society today, and why this documentary is, I believe, an important, and not just an important, but an incredibly important watch. Should almost be required viewing for everyone. Because if we don't know the systems that have been built to really keep people not only in a certain frame of mind, but to keep people in a certain status of citizenship, then we'll continue to think that the things that happen to minorities in this country are accidents, when they're really byproducts of the deliberate decisions of lawmakers, lobbyists, very powerful corporate business owners and corporate executives. There is a real orchestrated effort, and has been for quite some time now, where we see that there is a powerful financial interest in the incarceration of people. And that's just one of the things that 13th ends up highlighting throughout its runtime as a documentary. So the doc begins with some overtures by President Barack Obama as well as Van Jones, stating the crazy fact that despite having only 5% of the world's population, the U.S. is home to 25% of all incarcerated people in the world. And you'd think everyone that's incarcerated is a criminal, but that's just simply not the case. It also goes on to highlight how, despite the fact that the U.S. prison population was around 350,000 or so in 1960, it is now around 2.5 million people in the modern day, just about 1/4. And it's so crazy to think that as a species, criminality, we think the world is running rampant with criminals, but the truth of the matter is there's around 10 million jailed people in a world that's teetering right now on the population of 7.5 to 7.6 billion people. When you think about those numbers and figures, you realize that it really is just a small sliver and slice of the population. Yet and still, here in America, 1 in every 4 of those people is incarcerated. So after these facts are brought to bear by President Obama and Van Jones in those overtures, there's a gentleman that comes on screen and he speaks about the necessity of just coming to grips with the shared reality of the history of white and black America, a history of white America that has found them to be gladly on the side of oppressing people, even if it's by tacitly turning their backs and being silent in the face of oppression or actively participating in it. While for black America, it has been a history of fear and subjugation enforced by social violence as well as state violence. And how until we can reconcile the fact that those two realities have occurred, have existed, and do to a degree exist currently, there can be no progress made. Once it addresses that, it begins to move into the crux of the matter, the heart of the issue at hand in the documentary, which is that, as I just spoke about a second ago, the 13th Amendment, although it is hailed and celebrated as the end of slavery, it did not, in fact, end slavery in our country. And I use the term in fact because that's the reality, is that as the 13th Amendment was written, and I've mused about it on the show before, but we'll have a chance to do a deep dive today. The 13th Amendment was never written to end slavery. It was simply written to transfer the power of slavery over into the hands of the government, as opposed to having it in the hands of private citizens. They made it a state function instead of a private right. They said that no, black people can no longer be the property of individual citizens, but criminals can be the property of the state. And from there, it really begins to unfold in quite an incredible and dramatic way as it begins to go through the history of what that loophole, the except as punishment of crime, whereas the party shall have been duly convicted, that loophole really opened up a Pandora's box of what it means to be a criminal or a free person in American society. So the documentary goes on to talk about what happened in the wake of the Civil War, the era of Reconstruction here in the United States South, which is where the brunt of the war had taken place. And it's so interesting. I'm actually reading this book, The Coming Fury by Bruce Catton, which actually speaks very clearly about the socio-political events and kind of climate that led up to the Civil War. But 13th really goes in and highlights the issue at hand in the wake of the American Civil War, which almost destroyed this country. I don't think that we appreciate with enough gravity how serious that conflict was and how it still echoes in modern life. Here in the year 2022, there are still ramifications, ghosts of the Civil War that play an active role in everyday life. But there was a hard question that the South faced in the wake of the Civil War, which is that our cities and certain places and townships are destroyed. Our way of life as they knew it had been destroyed because they no longer could own black human beings as property. And they had to find a way to make up in their economy for the sudden loss of their free labor force? That was a hard question that the South faced in the immediate wake of the Civil War's end, which is that even though President Lincoln had been assassinated and there had been some measure of retribution taken out for the South against this president that came in and shattered their glorious way of life, right, where they were keeping black folks in chains, is that there was this very real question of how do we rebuild our economy and our literal social and physical infrastructure down here in the South. And so as they were working to hammer out the details of the 13th Amendment, going back and forth, because although it was known that the South had lost the Civil War, they still were very much influential in the politics of the day to a very high degree, because the North, while it was from an economic standpoint very powerful, from a military standpoint, they had the numbers. The truth is their textile mills would not have anything really to produce if it wasn't for the cotton fields in the South. And so the South still had a lot of leverage economically that they could wield. And so as they were hammering out the details of the 13th Amendment, this loophole gets introduced as a way to transform slavery from a product where, or from an institution where individuals can participate, to an institution that is now held solely in the power and discretion and as a function of the state, of the federal government. And I talk always about how that's one of the most disastrous uses of the term accept, when they say accept as punishment of crime in the 13th. But it was really powerful because those Southern business interests, the gentry of the South, the politicians from the South that still wielded some economic say-so in the goings-on of the country, even in the wake of their defeat in the Civil War, they needed a way to ensure that they weren't left totally in the lurch. And so as the South enters this period of Reconstruction, we see the convict leasing system really begin to take effect. The first wave of mass incarceration, if you will, which was that as soon as the 13th Amendment got passed, loitering laws and all these things began to get passed en masse in the South. And what that meant was that black people began to be arrested, from children through men and women, for being loiterers, for hanging around in public spaces past a certain period of time, or for being in unwanted public spaces, for making their presence happen there. It was just simply made illegal. That's what loitering laws are at their heart. They're put out as this thing to say, well, we don't want seedy and shady types just hanging out and up to no good doing nothing. But that is literally a racist byproduct of the attitudes of the time, where they looked at black people, these newly freed slaves, and the white folks of the time just didn't want to see them out in public. They didn't want to spend time around them. And so you had these loitering laws get passed, as well as vagrancy laws, which, if you think about the particular cruelty of vagrancy laws for a set of people that are just, and I mean just, fresh out of the bonds and chains of slavery, not able, who were promised 40 acres and a mule, but were not able to come up on that promise. Some of them were killed, and the U.S. government in many cases just flat out did not deliver. They didn't give anything over. It was said and made as a promise, and then immediately reneged upon by the Johnson administration, who succeeded President Lincoln and who is widely thought of as one of the worst presidents in the history of this country, Andrew Johnson. But we get to this point where vagrancy laws and loitering laws lead to a massive wave of arrests, and the beginning of what's known as the convict leasing system during the Reconstruction era. And moreover, we saw at the same time a wave of racial terrorism brought forth by the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and similar entities, whereby even black people that were beginning to become a little prosperous, who had been waiting for the moment to become freedmen, who were intelligent and who could organize themselves together politically to make things happen, where a lot of those communities were just flat out destroyed, where people were killed, their homes burned, their towns and cities razed. I think about the city of, I believe, either Wilmington or Raleigh in North Carolina, where there was a black delegation that had come into power, and it is the first coup d'etat on American soil, whereby an elected American government was overthrown by terrorists. And because the terrorists were other American citizens, the federal government just let it go. They let the politicians of that town and the business people of that town get killed off and ran out of town. It's just really interesting to see how all of that took place. And one of the interesting places the documentary goes to it highlights this is how, when we think about cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles, the suburbs and the boroughs of New York, where you see black people fleeing to Harlem and all these places, it wasn't that black people just wanted to up and go take jobs in those cities or were seeking better economic opportunity. Sure, that played a literal small role in it, but the truth is a majority of the people were fleeing for their lives. They were facing racial terrorism down in the South with no kind of judicial recourse or any kind of justice being offered. And so heading out of those cities was it was a genuine means for them to protect their lives and the lives of their families. But this is one of those byproducts where, once again, we see the hypercriminalization of black existence in public spaces for either vagrancy or loitering, combined with any black communities that are becoming relatively prosperous and organizing themselves into solid political units. They're straight up massacred and murdered. These are all the things that are coming into play in this Reconstruction era South, fresh outside of the Civil War and with the passage of this 13th Amendment that still allows slavery as punishment of crime, right? So it kicks us off there with that immediate piece of history showing that although it was written, even at the time it was written, there was a poison pill written into the 13th Amendment that made slavery a function of the state. But anyways, I digress. Let's get back into the flow of the documentary. So at this time, when they're incarcerating men, women, and children en masse for simply existing in public spaces as black people, we see the media, newspapers, and publications of the sort also actively participating. It's so crazy to think about the fact that the media has played that role since the beginning of all this, where they actively participate in the criminalizing and stereotyping of black bodies to sell paper. So back then, it was said that the newly freed Negroes would be rapists and would be the devils of the South, that they would go around terrorizing white communities and taking white women as their captives and just brutalizing them. This is what was being said in newspapers and in publications that were being spread throughout the country. And so there's an assault that the newly freed slaves are facing on every side at this point, where there are laws that make them simply existing in public spaces, even if and especially if they don't have a home or property of their own, having been newly freed and then immediately reneged upon in terms of the promise of 40 acres and a mule. There were a lot of them that just did not have places to go. They were freed, but freed into lives of vagrancy, which was then criminalized, which then caused them to be arrested and put on chain gangs. And now they're facing a news media that is making them out to be devils and demons to the public. It was this really continuous and well orchestrated assault on a set of people that had just been broken out of the bonds of an institution that dehumanized them for several hundred years. It really makes you think and wonder, like, what is it that was seen in these folks where they had to be treated so viciously, so brutally, and with such malicious lies and slander spread against them as a community, that even fresh out of slavery, when they were just trying to figure out how they were going to live lives as free people, the whole of society seemed to organize in this effort to subjugate them to a form of second or even third class citizenship in this country, that it still does continue on to this day, just in different forms. And we're going to get to that in due time. But continuing on with the flow of the documentary, it then dives into The Birth of a Nation, a film which came out in the early 20th century and which was praised by so many audiences and critics, including Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, talked about this film, which really glorified the KKK and portrayed white actors in blackface, but the black people in the film as these criminals and monsters that the people of the South, and really to a larger degree, the people of America, needed saving from, and that the KKK were these white knights. They were these knights riding to save the good white people of America from these brutish black beasts. The Birth of a Nation, which is one of the most destructive pieces of cinema and is one of the root films of Hollywood that they don't like to talk about, but it was one of the first cinematic sensations in this country. And that propaganda, that piece of propaganda, set social attitudes for decades to come, well into the latter part of the 20th century. And even in the modern day, there are still plenty of people, I would venture to say several million, if not millions of people that still harbor those racial attitudes and sentiments living within the borders and bounds of this country. It was such an effective piece of propaganda, in fact, that it rebirthed an enthusiasm for the KKK. It upped their membership and led to another wave of racial terror. We're talking about an increase in lynchings, public hangings, which were almost like a community event in certain communities in the South. When you wonder why people like Governor Ron DeSantis and others around this country are fighting against this thing they called critical race theory, which is this boogeyman, what they're really hiding and fighting is they're fighting to try and hide the real history of the fact that there are some people whose grandparents and great-grandparents are in those photographs of lynchings from the early 20th century, looking proudly on as they stand by a murdered black person. There are people who don't want to be reminded that this is not some ancient history. This is Mima and Papa that were out there at these community events looking at these horrors and these atrocities. And to think about the fact that a movie like Birth of a Nation, which was so critically well received, could shape these attitudes such that people are ashamed to look at their own grandparents and great-grandparents, just goes to let you know how not only impactful and effective a piece of propaganda it was, but just how close this history is. It's not ancient history, it's modern history that took place. But let's move on to just the way the film progresses. So when we talk about Birth of a Nation sparking an interest in the KKK and another wave of racial terrorism, there became a point where the lynchings became socially unacceptable. And so we see another evolution, which is segregation, where people say, okay, we're not going to lynch people publicly anymore and make it a community event, but we just want to live in our own spaces. So let's make these facilities separate but equal. Mind you, this is less than 100 years ago. There's plenty of people who are alive today that were alive during the period, that were adults during the period of segregation in this country. And I think about, and this is one of the things that we'll begin to notice as we dive even further and deeper into the film, is that there's this theme of the evolution of racism in its legal machinations in our society. Whereas it started as chattel slavery, one of the most brutal institutions in the history of humankind. And then once that was semi-outlawed because it was simply transferred over as a function of the state, it was never fully outlawed in our country. Then you begin to see racial terrorism, whereby entire city governments get taken over after they kill off politicians and business leaders. Then we see racial terrorism with lynchings and whatnot. We have obviously the propaganda that was put forth by the news media, culminating in a film like Birth of a Nation. But when social attitudes are beginning to change, because once again, black people are simply fighting to be seen as human beings. So in the 1920s, you're talking about only being 60 years removed from the end of a civil war that almost destroyed the country. You know, it's not ancient history at that point. It's still very much recent history. But we see this evolution now when lynchings and public racial terrorism become passé and out of style, that then segregation comes in, that Jim Crow laws get brought into the foreground and the forefront of this battle to keep black folks subjugated in this country. And we see, you know, the criminalization of the civil rights movement, where Dr. King and Rosa Parks and many other civil rights leaders get arrested for simply doing peaceful lunch counter protests and sit-ins, for riding on the bus and not getting up when a white man said that he wanted to take her seat. Like, all these things are happening, and there was this wave of incarceration again as people protested for their literal civil and human rights, where in a generation of human beings, being arrested became fashionable. They were arresting people for so little that it became a sign that you were participating in the fight for your human rights when you were arrested. But once again, we still haven't even gotten to the evolution of how big money begins to play a role in what we now know as the prison industrial complex, because the film is still laying out the groundwork and the framework, if you will, for how racism and racial terrorism fueled social attitudes towards black people that eventually led to black people being thought of as criminals. It started in the immediate wake of the end of slavery, and at every turn it has been seen, and the black man has been seen as this unwieldy beast. That has been the case for quite some time. And Ava really does a masterful job of walking the viewer along, letting them know that, hey, it's not just, not only has it been step by step, it's not just an accident that things are this way, but it's a well thought out and orchestrated plan that, much like a cancer that refuses to go away, right? When you thought you've nabbed the cancer in one way, it metastasizes to another part of the body. And so now you have to treat that part, but then it metastasizes somewhere else. And that has been the legacy of racism, especially as it pertains to the legacy and history of the non-ending of slavery. Because I want to once again just reiterate so that people can be honest with themselves and know the fact that slavery is not illegal in the United States. It has not been abolished. It was simply made a function of the government. That's all. All they said was that private citizens can't own slaves. Only the government has the power to do that if someone's been convicted of a crime. And then they immediately got to criminalizing black existence in many ways. And what I don't want people to take from this is any kind of a victim mentality, because at the same time, we have to understand that there are people who make bad and poor choices, to be certain. But at the same time, I guarantee you right now, there's at a minimum, thousands, if not possibly tens of thousands of innocent people sitting inside of our prisons who are legal slaves by the definition of the 13th Amendment. But let's keep things moving though. So we see civil rights leaders getting arrested, and we see this movement at a time in our nation's history where these tensions are really kind of bubbling over a bit. And in the wake of the assassination of President Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson comes into office and he signs a civil rights bill as well as a voting rights bill into law, essentially outlawing many of the practices that have been taking place across the South in the United States, literacy laws and other things like this, or literacy tests that they were forcing people to take when they wanted to go vote and exercise their constitutional right. There were all these things that were being done across the South, especially to black folks, that were hindering them from being able to actively participate in their civic duty as voters. And at the same time these laws are being passed, there's a slight uptick in the crime rate. It doesn't really mean that there's a ton of crime going on. All it was that the baby boomer generation, which was literally an explosion of the population, as you see more people around, there's going to be an increase in crime. It's just the demographic shifts. But white leadership latched onto it and very critically pointed out that, see, if we give the blacks more freedom, we're going to see a rise and an uptick in crime. That was so important for them. Once again, it continues on in that long legacy of the criminalizing of just simple black humanity, using anything and everything they can to continue to paint black people in a certain way. And then Richard Nixon comes onto the scene. His Southern strategy works masterfully. He talks about the need to get rid of the anti-war left and blacks, as well as feminism. And he doesn't say it in those terms. It's the dog whistles that he's using, claiming that there's a need for law and order. And that has been the dog whistle from then all the way since. It's been this thing where if you are attempting to change the system in any way, then you're an anarchist. And the truth of the matter is they've been able to co-opt that term law and order, which simply means the established racial and social order here in this country, upheld by laws and law enforcement that has carte blanche to act violently against any who oppose it. But Nixon and his war on drugs was really a game-changing moment for conservative politics as well as for the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party, and this is highlighted by many of them today as they try and point out how the Democrats are somehow the bad guys, which I won't even get into politics on this issue. But the Republican Party was kind of founded as an abolitionist party. It was founded as a way to bring black people more into the political fold here in the U.S. And then as President Nixon was seeking to win votes across the South, he realized maybe he can't speak directly to segregation, but what he can say is that there's a need for law and order. And one of his strategists, John Ehrlichman, finally admitted to the fact that what they wanted to do was smear the anti-war left as well as black freedom fighters all together. And they found that if they could associate the anti-war left with weed, with marijuana, if they could associate black communities with heroin, if they could associate feminism with weed and the like, then they could turn public opinion against them. They knew that what they were putting out there wasn't true, the messaging wasn't true, but it was an effective vote-getting strategy because they could drum up racial resentment and fears, tie drugs into those communities, and then use drugs as this scourge on society as a reason, as a motivation, and an excuse to terrorize those communities into submission, essentially, right? So then Ronald Reagan comes into the picture after Richard Nixon kicks off his war on drugs. And while the prison population certainly jumped when Richard Nixon was in office, Ronald Reagan really begins the era of mass incarceration, where you see an explosion in the prison population. And he took Nixon's messaging to a whole other level. In fact, one of his advisors, Lee Atwater, kind of outlined the strategy. He was caught on a secret recording saying that you start out in 1954 by saying, N-word, N-word, N-word. But then by 1968, you can't do that. It's going to get you hurt. So you say things like forced busing and states' rights. And by this point now, you're getting so abstract that here we're talking about tax cuts, and it's totally economical stuff. But the byproduct and result of it is that the blacks get hurt worse than the whites. This is one of his strategists laying out the strategy at the table. I'll never understand the psychological factors that drive some of the attitudes in this country. What I can say is that, at the very least, I'm glad that at least someone like him, even if he didn't know he was being recorded, he had those moments of candor where it's like, no, you can't come and lie and say one thing. We know what's really behind it, because the gaslighting aspect of it certainly is there, where politicians will pretend that, no, these are just social policies aimed at the greater social good. But they know what's going on behind it. They know the aim and goal and intent of some of these laws that are being passed. So with Reagan, you see the private prison industry come into formation. And why is that important? It's important because we see the goals of that except as punishment of crime, that clause, they now come full circle. It may have taken over 100 years, but the descendants of the slave owners are now able to benefit. Whereas slavery was made a function of the state when it comes to the 13th Amendment, CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, which began in 1983, now transfers that power back from the state into the hands and the pockets of private citizens, shareholders of this corporation, which now participates in correctional facilities. It's this way to frame it, to market themselves, right? But now we see the full fruition of what was intended when that loophole was written into the 13th Amendment, which is that you've reprivatized slavery, because what you've done is first you said, well, it's abolished except if you're a criminal. Then you begin to criminalize an entire section and set of people within the country. And then at a certain point, you reintroduce private hands and profit into the equation again. And that's what happened under President Reagan's watch. Not to mention that his war on drugs and the 100-to-1 sentencing ratios for the difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Not only the fact that they were destroying minority communities, especially black communities, by taking fathers and sons and uncles and nephews and mothers and sisters and daughters away from their families for simple possession of things like marijuana or crack. This was a health crisis that was going on, and instead people were criminalized and thrown in jail, ripped from their families, and then given extremely, extremely long sentences. So it talks about how after Reagan, and we realize the political climate in this country gets to the point where if you're running for a high office in the land like the presidency, you have to be quote unquote tough on crime, meaning you have to say law and order and those things, but the byproduct of it is that you're hurting minority, black and Latino and Native American communities the worst, right? And you would think that, okay, the Republicans have taken on the conservative mantle. The Democrats, due to the ideological shift that took place with the Southern strategy that was effectively employed by Nixon, now have this chance to regain the initiative. But no, they fall right in line. President Clinton comes along. It's one of those things that I get weirded out by people who have these fond memories of him or said he was like an honorary member of the black community, because what Ava DuVernay does is she effectively highlights how his crime bill in 1994, which was co-authored and sponsored by our current president, Joe Biden, worked to savagely destroy especially the black community, but a ton of minority communities. Between the three strikes laws, the mandatory minimums, and then the mandatory time served, like, and we're going to get into how this corporation or this lobbying group, not a corporation, it's a lobbying group comprised of corporations and politicians. It's called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. ALEC. ALEC has been around since the 80s, and ALEC has been instrumental in introducing legislation that has had a detrimental effect on minority communities in this country, including three strikes laws, including mandatory minimums and mandatory sentencing guidelines in terms of how much time a person has to serve once they're sentenced. ALEC introduced literally all of those. And for those who don't know what ALEC is, I highly encourage you to go and look them up, because what they have been doing, and I talked about this just a few weeks ago when I spoke about the bribery, the legalized system of bribery that we call lobbying in this country. Once it was that unlimited money could be married into our political system, all bets were off, and ALEC has been especially effective. I'm talking, and this company is no longer a direct member of ALEC, although its owners do continue to contribute to ALEC, but Walmart, State Farm Insurance, CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, DirecTV, all of these companies, they literally write laws, they get together in groups with serving politicians and corporate lawyers, lobbyists, and they pass on those bills and they say, hey, we need this passed. It's literally how laws are getting made across the board in this country. ALEC is one of those big players, in addition to the Federalist Society, that has been shaping legal precedent and laws in this country for quite some time. The Federalist Society more on the judicial side of things, and ALEC more on the corporate and legislative side of things. But I bring it up to say that there are all these things that have now stemmed from the 13th Amendment, including the private prison and the prison industrial complex, which is more than just, and the documentary does a great job of highlighting how it's not just the correctional facilities, but there's a vast network of companies that supply these facilities, that supply their food, their medicine, the cots and beds. So there's a whole economy worth billions, tens of billions of dollars that has a vested interest in the institution of slavery under the guise of criminal punishment. It has shaped social and political attitudes inside of this country. And I don't want to spoil the entirety of the documentary. I will go on to say that it ends with showing law enforcement's role in this, right? How they are more apt and willing to kill black citizens, how they're more violent and forceful with black citizens, how social attitudes, especially negative ones towards black citizens in this country, have been shaped by these laws and policies. And needless to say, 13th remains a powerful, powerful documentary, really showing exactly how, from this one amendment that was written into our Constitution with a poison pill, entire systems have been built and are now entrenched to form oppression, especially against Black, Latino, Native American, all minority communities here in this country, with some of the side effects being that poor white people also are suffering at the hands of these, which is one of those things that I'm like, yo, I look at poor white folks, whether you're talking about in Appalachia or even here in Florida, sometimes it's like you're helping to participate in your own self-oppression because you don't want to reconcile with a system that you're helping to uphold. But my hope and goal is that eventually we're able to reconcile the truths of the past with a better future. But we can't do that if we don't acknowledge it. And 13th is, to me, an incredible documentary that does its best. And I mentioned at the beginning of the synopsis that I got to the end and I realized just how all-encompassing it is. I think Ava really did her best to try and encapsulate it all. But there's so much that takes place. There's so much that has taken place. The fact that now literally private citizens, they've tied people's pensions, and people's pensions are wrapped up in the slave trade industry here in our country. There are people that have pensions invested. There are hedge funds whose pensions are invested in corporations like CCA or in the American Bail Coalition. There are all these things that have now wrapped and woven themselves into the fabric of society. And if we're not careful, if we're not careful, it's going to rot and erode our society out from the inside. As I said, though, I don't want to spoil everything. We're coming up to the close of the hour of this show, and so I'm going to get to my final conclusive thoughts on it and then our final thought for this week before we wrap things up. If you've been watching on YouTube, thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you've been listening in on the radio. Thank you for listening, and go check the show out on YouTube. Would love to hear from you. Would love to put a face to the name, to hear from you guys and see you guys. But thank you so much for listening. We're going to get to our conclusion in just a second and wrap up this week's episode of Let's Talk About It here on No Alter Egos. So just a quick wrap up on 13th by Ava DuVernay. I think that she does the best job that I'm not going to say is possible, but I mean, it'd really have to be a limited series or some kind of a docu-series to get the job done. For the hour and 40 minutes that it encompasses, though, it really is a brave and incredible retelling and recounting of a very brutal history that should be acknowledged. It's not to say that you feel this extreme guilt, but if all people are going to do is bury their heads in the sand and pretend that what has happened hasn't happened, then atrocities will continue to happen unchecked and unabated. And I think part of the purpose of 13th was to highlight how there is this thing, this 13th Amendment, which from its terrible writing in the first place has stemmed all these other social ills and evils. It's not to say that it's solely responsible, but it certainly is a cornerstone in some of the modern day social ills that we face as a country. And I applaud her for the effort. I think that everyone should go ahead and watch it. Obviously, you're going to get a little bit of my personal tastes and biases towards it because as someone who has read and is an ardent student of history, I have a bit of context with which I can watch and appreciate the film. But even if you aren't someone who, is a Civil War buff or who is a buff on the history of America, it certainly does present itself in a manner by which it's easily digestible, both by the layman and the expert alike, which is not to claim that I'm some kind of expert, but I'm just saying, if you have a good knowledge of history, you won't find any myths, truths, or misgivings. And if you are someone who does not or has not studied a lot of history, it certainly will introduce you to and open your eyes up to a lot of the things that have been going on, both in the shadows and out in the open in our country, social attitudes and some of the laws and social engineering that have taken place as a result of slavery not really being abolished here in our country, but instead being made a function of the state. And from that, all the horrible evils and violence of slavery, at least in my opinion, we can now see it in things like police brutality. We forget that chattel slavery, as much as there are writers in the South that would like to say that there was an affinity that the master had for their slaves and whatnot, it was a brutal and dehumanizing system at its core that destroyed families, lives, and the humanity of an entire set of people in this country for several centuries. And even since its quote unquote end, which we know at this point, I hope you are aware of the fact that it never really ended. But ever since the 13th was written, it just provided a vehicle through which the evil of slavery can continue to metastasize itself in the public consciousness and the public subconscious as we go about our daily lives. I think she did a wonderful job, though, and I would highly recommend that if you have not yet watched 13th, or even if you have already watched it, go back and rewatch it. Allow yourself to absorb its lessons. Personally, I know that I refuse to be some kind of hero for a community, but I do know that if we collectively are able to see what has been going on and become more active participants in the fate and destiny of Black people or minorities here in America, then we can see better outcomes in the future as well. I didn't even make mention of the fact that they talk about how Fred Hampton and his Rainbow Coalition, he was just straight up murdered. How whenever you talk about Black empowerment movements or Black people seeking some kind of leadership to come together and galvanize them socially, that leadership is effectively hunted down and eliminated by the U.S. government, by the FBI and other branches of the U.S. government. It's been quite the harrowing tale. And 13th, as I said, there's so much that has gone on that by the time I got to the end of it, I realized, holy crap, there's so much you have to cover. Maybe it would have been better served as a docuseries, but even for the documentary that it is, It really does an excellent job of just highlighting this massive flaw in what has been sold to the public as the end of the great sin and stain on the past of America, which currently stains us to our present because it was never quite washed away. It was always allowed to fester and remain. But we're going to get into our final thought of the day. Thank you guys so much for sticking through to this point. And that thought is this: personal responsibility is everything. Even in a society where there are sometimes that personal responsibility can be overruled, even when we're talking, or especially when we're talking about encounters and interactions with law enforcement. But we're the product of our choices. And my hope and wish for everyone, but especially in the Black, Native American, and Latin American communities, is that we understand the power of our choices and how collectively you can make better outcomes for your communities, for our communities, if we decide to have stronger values and stand together stronger as individuals. You know, one of the things that the doc mentioned is that even Black people, due to the fact that if you look on the local evening news, the people that you're going to see on there most for committing crimes are Black people, mostly young Black men. And it leads to this social erosion of trust, even among Black people, for ourselves. You know, as a young Black man, there's times I have to remind myself out in public, especially if I'm around a certain group, like, they're just people, bruh. You know, I can't look at them and think that, okay, they look and dress and talk a certain way, so I just got to be on my P's and Q's. Like, I'm like that generally because we live in a country where mass shootings happen regularly. But the truth is, we really have to take more personal responsibility, and we do to a large degree. But I'm here to challenge, especially the Black community as a whole, that we can take a little bit more. That if we stop collectively looking for a Messiah and a Savior and for people to come and be martyrs, if we decide on an individual basis that we're going to seek to do better for ourselves, you know, while it may still take time because we do live in a system that is designed to suppress that as much as possible, but we give ourselves a better chance at greater outcomes. You know, we got to stop looking for saviors and start understanding that the saviors that we're looking for are right in the mirror. And despite the obstacles that we may face as a community, there is hope for a better future, and one that we can collectively participate in building by making good individual decisions on a day-to-day basis. I know life can be stressful. I know those things can be tough, but my hope and wish is that as a community, we look in the mirror and understand that we have more power in our hands as individuals as we give ourselves credit for. And if we begin to make the best choices that we can, even in the face of overwhelming odds and circumstances, we can improve the odds and circumstances for everyone collectively. So go through this week. Remember that you have power in your hands, especially in the power of your choices in your decisions. Make the best choices that you can for yourself. I know it won't always be easy, but my prayer and hope for you all, as well as for myself, is that we make the best decisions that we can this week. Take care of yourselves, and as always, God bless.
Looking in the mirror, I know I'm imperfect, just like everybody else I know. Most times I wish the world looked beneath the surface, but I guess that's how life goes. Had to learn to love myself this time around. Pop a bottle and then take a sip just because. Book a flight and then take a trip just because. Love myself just because.